Farouk Muadid, Muadid.com. In this video, let's take a look at primary trend lines. And by primary trend lines, by definition, they are lines that connect to major all-time highs. For example, here is a major all-time high in 2007. So of course, we're not talking about this period after that. So as of 2007, this was the all-time high. I hope that makes sense. So primary trend line in this particular instant in 2009 is connected with the closing high here, and this closing high that was good enough to make this straight line, and that's a primary trend line. Why? Because at the time it was connected to a major all-time high. Once you move above a primary trend line, it tends to be a reliable change in direction and sentiment. We can see here that once the stock cleared that primary trend line, we start moving higher off the lows of early 2009. Now this works also in terms of indicators, trend line and price trend line. Let's take a look at another trend line that I can see here. So this was the previous all-time low, and of course as of 2007 there was a trend line connecting the weekly closing lows. So once we break below that trend line here, you can see that the stock goes sideways and then ultimately does not close back above that blue line and drifts lower. That's another trend line example. Let's take a look at another trend line example. It's this weekly closing high and this weekly closing high, because this trend line here corresponds to a major all-time high as of 2012. Once we move above this trend line, that's another trend line break, and of course you can see that that also led to a nice movement in price. Oh, by the way, before I forget, check the description where I give you a link that takes you to my YouTube playlist where I discuss primary trend lines. So if you want to learn more on primary trend lines, take a look at that playlist. As of right now, we can see that if we take the lows here in 2009 and the lows on a weekly closing basis here and here, we can draw a trend line that should look something like that. And you see we've not broken below this trend line yet. Now, let's take a look at the MACDs. Remember, the primary trend line also works for indicators. Let's take a look at the MACDs. And here we can see that there was a MACD trend line break. This connected with MACD lows here and tried to bounce here, but once we break below here, of course we see that that is corresponding with a price drop. That's a primary trend line. There was also another line at the time. This was the MACD lows at the time, all-time lows here, and once we have a trend line break, which again corresponds with this same period and price drop there, you can see that this is what led to this drop. And as discussed in the prior MACD video, if you take this low on the MACD and draw a trend line, you see that it connects here to this lows, extend it out, and you can see this is another primary trend line. Why is it primary? Again, because this is a major all-time low on the MACD. So any trend line break is going to be a primary trend line break. Once we break below that, the stock comes off the highs of 2015. We also see that this was the lows of the MACD as of 09, connected to the lows here, extended out. This is a primary trend line. Why? Again, because it connects to this MACD all-time lows. Once we break below that, we come off the highs of 2015. And so we're talking about coming off the highs here when the MACD trend lines broke. Now let me bring back the RSI. So now here we have the RSI. Let's take a look at the primary trend lines as far as the RSI is concerned. And we can see that these were the lows of the RSI, all-time lows as of 07. So you connect the lows, something like that. And again, once we broke below this trend line, which was a primary trend line, we drop. There's another trend line connecting the highs here. So there's a trend line. Why was it a primary trend line? Because it connects to the highs of the RSI here and also corresponds with the all-time highs at the time. Once we move above that trend line here, you can see prices recover. There's another trend line break, RSI highs connected to these highs here, something like that. You can see again it was a primary trend line because it corresponds to this RSI highs. So once it moves above this price range or that trend line, the blue line, you can see that it corresponds with prices advancing and we go into a nice run. Keep in mind, we drew this line previously and this line became relevant because once it broke below here, it corresponds with this drop period. Now there's another trend line, which is the break. These are the current all-time lows on the RSI, and so we can generate this trend line based on the fact that it connects to all-time lows on the RSI, which means that this blue line is a primary trend line. Breaking of a primary trend line suggests that a major change is taking place, and that also led to this break here led to these prices coming off the highs and this drop. So by paying attention to trend lines, you can gauge direction, but more importantly, if you can make sure you understand the primary trend lines, because they tend to give better signals. So always we need to be more on the lookout for primary trend lines as opposed to any type of other trend line, because primary trend lines do indicate a major change in direction, something that we can take into consideration when trying to find situations where we expect potential for instruments to change direction. Eric Muadh, muadh.com. Again, in the description, I'll have a link to this primary trend line playlist. Peace and blessings. EACS. Can you hear this, baby? Can you hear this, baby?